It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented by Film Seizure. Let's get back into some body horror with this week's entries. So this week I'm going to look at David Cronenberg's Shivers from 1975. Way back early on in the series here of Monster Mondays, I talked about 1977's Rabid, which was his follow-up to this, and like that film, Shivers deals with something of a parasite that is infecting people. Upon its release, Shivers would become a massive hit and was said to be the highest grossing Canadian film to date at the time. So, obviously it was popular, but that didn't necessarily mean that it was overly liked. Critics at the time were pretty down on the film. They cited it as being violent, gory, and sexually depraved. It was definitely something that ruffled some feathers in Canada because there, if you make a film with enough Canadian actors, locations, etc., the film is actually funded by the government under the then named Canadian Film Development Corporation. So some Canadian critics brought the film down, thinking that the film was a little too dirty and a little too violent for it to have been funded by the public at large. One critic in particular, Robert Fulford, even went on to make sure people were aware that they were funding this type of stuff instead of some other, stuffy art stuff, whatever. That made it really difficult in the future for Cronenberg to get funding for future projects because Fulford's high-profile critique was enough to throw some weight around, even though Fulford's column where he reviewed movies was under a pseudonym because I guess he was more of a journalist or an essayist, but that to me kind of gives me some weird feelings. So allow me to explain. For me, Fulford being an essayist, and at that an editorial essayist, is just fine. He often had columns in arts pages and would write things that would help promote Canadian arts. Great, I like that. However, I'm not so sure he perceives film as much of a highly touted art. Sure, he reviewed film, but he did it under a different name, almost as if to separate that from his art and literature critiques. That doesn't exactly sit well with me. Now, true, Joe Bob Briggs is an assumed name of one John Bloom. However, Bloom, as well as being a cultural critic and essayist, is absolutely a film scholar as well. He took the name Joe Bob Briggs not to separate his critique of film from other cultural stuffs, but to play a bit of a role that fit the films that he wanted to review. If anyone from Canada listens to this show and has any background on Fulford, drop it into the comments. I'd be greatly appreciative. It just feels strange to me. Here in the American Midwest, we had Roger Ebert from Chicago, who was both a great Pulitzer Prize winning writer and a great film critic who didn't feel he needed to separate his very public movie reviewing persona from his other writings. But again, what do I know? The movie opens with a slideshow for Starliner Towers, 12 minutes outside of Montreal. It looks to be the height of modern luxury on an island to itself with all the stores and services needed right there in the building. A couple has come for an appointment. Noticing that the doorman carries a gun, they question that a little bit, but meanwhile, a woman named Annabelle is being attacked by an older man named Dr. Hobbs. While Hobbs undresses the girl, cuts her open and pours acid into her wound, another resident, Nick Tudor, is experiencing stomach pains. Back at Annabelle's place, Hobbs slashes his own throat after pouring the acid into her belly. Nick later finds their bodies, but doesn't seem to do anything about it. Later, the in-building doctor, Dr. St. Luke, does find the bodies and calls the cops. St. Luke is later told by an associate of Hobbs that they were working on an alternative to organ transplant. Linsky, this associate of Hobbs, says that Hobbs developed a parasite that would go into the body, it would eat out the failed organ and take the place of that organ, and then do its work without needing to find a donor. Hobbs was even funded by an association of organ transplanters. In the meantime, Nick's condition worsens, and he starts coughing up blood and even a little wormy thing that crawls back into the building through a vent in the laundry room. The wormy thing attacks an old lady and begins to eat at her face. What's more, others in the building are complaining of similar symptoms of abdominal pain that Nick is having. As for Nick, he's grown cold to his wife and even starts talking to the parasites in his belly. And as it turns out, Hobbs was trying not so much to create a parasite to help with organ transplants. Oh no, he was creating something that was a combination of, quote, aphrodisiac and venereal disease that would hopefully turn the world into one mindless orgy, unquote. Hobbs was a total nut that believed people had basically become too smart and didn't seem to act on their animalistic desires and impulses enough. So apparently, he was planning on fixing that. Linsky also says that St. Luke shouldn't go anywhere near people who are acting too impulsively. You see, that Annabelle girl was who Hobbs was experimenting on because she was a comely lass. Things got a little out of hand, and that's why Hobbs wanted to try to destroy the parasite she had in her. However, she was pretty popular. An older guy in the building as well as Nick both had visits with her, and they are both experiencing the same symptoms of abdominal pain. The parasites multiplied quickly and began infecting all sorts of the people who live in Starliner Towers. A delivery man infects a woman and her little girl. The little girl infects the doorman. It's a bizarre and gross thing, but it's effective. While the parasites quickly work through all the inhabitants of the building, St. Luke and his girlfriend, Nurse Forsyth, hide out, hoping the police will soon be there to find them. Linsky finally arrives to take a look at Nick, but he's attacked by the parasites that are just kind of hanging out all over Nick's torso. Nick kills Linsky and maybe the last hope of containing the parasites and killing them all off. Meanwhile, in the basement, Forsyth reveals that she's been infected and tries to infect St. Luke, but he punches her out and ties some cloth around her mouth to stop her from releasing a parasite form. St. Luke then tries to get her out of the building, but they are overwhelmed by infected people. St. Luke escapes and finds Linsky's body with Nick leaning over him, and the doc kills Nick and tries to find a way out. Everywhere he turns, though, he finds infected people. He finds Nick's wife Janine and her friend Betts, who's played by Barbara Steele, one of the classic horror icons of the 60s. And they are hanging out in the swimming pool where he does find a sliding door that he can open and out to freedom, but he only finds more and more infected people kind of descending on him and blocking his path like a swarm of zombies. Betts pulls him into the pool where Nurse Forsyth is waiting to infect St. Luke. The movie ends with St. Luke, Forsyth, and the others who are infected in the building who haven't been killed or died spreading out in news reports informing the public to stay calm while the police deal with the rash of sexual assaults. So let's get to my 3 things that I like about Shivers. First up, I love these 70s apartments in this movie. I like the idea of the apartment being on an island outside of Montreal and tries to be all modern by having everything needed either on the island itself or in the building. Then all the apartments have these extremely 70s features and furniture. In the Tudor's bedroom, they have these psychedelic paper lantern things. They have these low-sitting couches and chairs that have like this orange vinyl upholstery. It looks both disgusting and comfortably uncomfortable. Second, to kind of roll off my first I like how this movie is one of those isolated sort of horrors that that could spread something. It's a ground zero type of thing. The building being on an island, while not too far away from a major city like Montreal, it still is isolated. There are some movies that do this sort of thing in an urban setting, and I always like that. It juxtaposes the whole modern creature comfort thing with how it can easily fall apart. Those who are infected are able to cut the phone lines or make it so the door in the parking garage won't open. So yeah, it's a great thing that this place has everything that you could possibly want in it in one single building or a single island, like a commune, but it doesn't really help when something works its way through all the inhabitants or starts to break down the system. And thirdly, this is another example of David Cronenberg doing a parasitic infection, making people act like zombies without being actually zombies. As I discussed way back when I talked about his next film, Rabid, we're not dealing with zombies, but an infection that still makes people act in a sort of mindless manner. Whereas Rabid was more of a vampiric person in need of blood, which then transmits something like rabies to her victims, this is a literal organism that is changing the way people are thinking by increasing their libidos and impulsions. This is more of an example of science fiction. There have been plenty of examples throughout the course of sci-fi between various movies like Invaders from Mars or later with Star Trek The Next Generation, where parasites are introduced to the body that changes the person to carry out the needs of the parasite itself. Cronenberg just takes it to its logical body horror conclusion. Seeing the skin undulate under the, from the wormy parasites or the parasites protruding from people's mouths, it's just gross. It makes you feel icky. Then as the people start to act decadent, they get sweaty and they eat messy things and they get, that get all over themselves. It just kind of makes your skin crawl. And then knowing that some of the people who are affected are children, there's a whole nother psychological element to that where, obviously the children are also acting out on things that they shouldn't be, or people are doing things to them that they shouldn't be. It's just makes you want to take a shower afterwards. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com, as well as places where fine podcasts are found like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. Additionally, why don't you hop on over to Facebook and Twitter and follow us there by just searching for Film Seizure. You can also check out new posts at my website, bmovieenema.com, each and every Friday morning. So until next week, stay spooky.